Our speaker is Adam Novey. He is the Executive Director and Curator of the historic Indian Agency House in Portage, Wisconsin. He received his Master's of Arts in History from Liberty University, as well as a Museum Studies certificate from Northwestern University. He also holds CNP certification through the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance. His scholarly interests include American Indian policy in antebellum America, as well as related early frontier issues, particularly the Redbird Uprising of 1827. So Adam, welcome, and thank you for sharing your knowledge of this site.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. Just share my screen quick, and we'll get started. All right, is that showing up for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Well, welcome to the historic Indian Agency House at Fort Winnebago. Like Tina mentioned, we're located in Portage, Wisconsin. We're operated by the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in the state of Wisconsin. And we've been a museum here for about 87 years. And been a museum for quite a while, but we have quite an interesting story to tell. So excited to share a little bit about that with you guys, and look forward to your questions and discussing it further in the chat period. So as we get started today, start with a story that just sort of illustrates the kind of history that is present here at the Agency House. The story takes place in October of 1830. In October of 1830, the federal government was meeting with the Ho-Chunk Native American nation here on this site. As part of their process of paying the Ho-Chunk, paying for had been forcibly sold about 2 years, actually a year earlier. So the scene that you'd see in 1830 was you'd have about 400 heads of households of the Ho-Chunk Nation, representing about 4,000 individuals gathered on this site. And Indian agent John Kinsey was, of course, here to pay them, to meet with them. But he also had specific instructions during this particular annuity payment. His instructions came from a missionary in the Kentucky area who requested that John ask the Ho-Chunk to set aside money from their annuity payment to educate some of their young men at the Choctaw Academy. And this was part of the government's larger picture initiative to attempt to educate younger members of America's native nations to try to assimilate them into United States society. At that time, policymakers saw their only decision, or their only choice, was to remove the natives or assimilate them. And that was the common viewpoint of the time. So it was the government encouraged the establishment of this Choctaw Academy. And so John Kinsey, the Indian agent here at Fort Winnebago, was now tasked with requesting the Ho-Chunk to send some of their young men there. So he gathered some of the major leaders of the tribe, who you actually see some of their portraits behind me. They gathered about probably 400 feet behind me, where Pierre Paquette's fur trading post was. And there they held a council where John presented them with the idea of sending their youth to be educated. And thankfully for the historic record, the Indian agent transcribed their response. And you can see it here on the screen. Father, if the Great Spirit had made us like white men, he would have given us a way to be educated like them. We must not do anything contrary to what our great father above has done. If he had seen proper for us to be educated, he would have made us made us different from the white men. We have gone on thus far without it, and we wish to remain in the same state that we have ever been. We think that if we were to commence educating our children, the Great Spirit would be angry and by some means destroy us. There are none of us who now appear to be anxious to have our children educated. Perhaps by and by we may think as you do, Father. So this difference of opinion, this difference of basically worldview, viewpoint between the government and the Ho-Chunk Nation on this particular issue, where the Ho-Chunk believed that they should be educating their children in their traditional way, which they believed was best for them, versus the viewpoint from the government that the European system of education was superior. This conflict between views is really emblematic of the sort of just the big picture story of our agency. It was the basically the place where two different cultures were interacting, at times clashing, at times learning from each other. And so this is the kind of story that we're going to be digging into a little bit more today. This type of interaction was taking place during a unique time in our history, but also at a unique place. And so first we're going to talk a little bit about the place. The Portage of the Fox and the Wisconsin River, known to the Ho-Chunk as Wawona, and to the French as La Portage, or the carrying place, is located, you can see on your screen, on the left side of the screen where that red circle is. This is the point at which the Fox River and the Wisconsin River come within about 1.25 miles of each other. There's only marsh separating the two, but the Fox River flows north and the Wisconsin River flows south. The Fox River ties in to Lake Michigan. So that's the beginning of this particular location's importance. The other side of this location's importance is that the Wisconsin River connects into the Mississippi. So this is the only 1 1/4 mile stretch of land between the Great Lakes and by extension the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. So this was considered the best way to get into the Mississippi River corridor. Mississippi would led all the way up into the far reaches of Minnesota. You could get onto the Missouri River from here, extend all the way out to the Rocky Mountains. If you wanted to go the other way, you could get up into Ohio. So this portage became important already back in archaic times. Our site here was occupied by people since we've confirmed it back to archaic times, which is about the time of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. And it's seen pretty continuous habitation ever since. When the fur trade began in Wisconsin, this became one of the major fur trade routes of the Midwest. I've heard it said that Portage saw more furs and trade goods carried across it than any other waterway in the Midwest. So we're at an important place for both indigenous peoples, settlers, traders, and as a result, we're seeing a lot of different types of people interacting with each other at this location from very early on in history. So that's sort of the importance of the place. And before I go into the discussion of the times, we're going to take a little bit of a lot of the sites that have been illustrated on these second presentation series have to do with the Revolutionary War. Our magazine does, a lot of them do. So I thought go a little bit into our Revolutionary War history. And it's not a place you'd expect it, but in 1777 to 1778, Charles Langlade, the Indian agent, or might call him an agent, but the Indian liaison of Great Britain led Great Lakes tribes in the conflict in the East. So he would gather up tribes from Wisconsin, Michigan, even up parts of Canada, and send them out, actually accompany them out to, I know particularly the St. Lawrence Valley, and were involved in some of the military actions out there. Well, Charles Langlade's nephew was named Charles Gautier, and he was one of the people who was sent by Langlade to gather these Native allies. And as Gautier went through Wisconsin, he used the Portage as a central gathering point along the way. The Ho-Chunk tribe, the part of them living on the Rock River, which is south of here, extends all the way down to the Mississippi. That group of people joined Gautier here. We know that some Dakota, some some Menominee people came to this site as a sort of a jumping off point to join with Gautier and by extension Langlade in the Revolution. And this history of the Revolution, where most of the tribes of the Midwest joined with Britain, and later in the War of 1812, you see the same thing, was one of the things that shaped American Indian policy. After the Revolution, the government wanted to establish government trading houses to take away the influence of British traders and replace it with American trade. The issues that we'll talk about a little bit later with that were going on at our Indian agency, some of them had their roots back in this British versus American tribal alliance dynamics. So it's a little bit of an interesting side point that the Portage, which is pretty far away from most of the Revolutionary War sites in the United States, actually did have a little bit to do with the war. Well, back to the Portage. So the Portage was a place where people were hauling material from one point, basically point A to point B, and as such, different people, different backgrounds, interacting and times clashing, times getting to know each other, and that's where our agency comes in. In the 1830s, this use as a cultural crossroads became official when the government established a federal Indian agency at the Portage in the Wisconsin rivers. And the house right next door to here was built in 1832 as that embassy between the federal government and the Ho-Chunk Nation. The agency was established through the Treaty of 1829.
Adam, I think your mic's out. It was kind of going in and out a little bit there now. I think it might start to interrupt, but
back now?
It's kind of in and out, like it's getting half the sentences.
Okay. Well, let's see what I can do here. All right. Is that better?
So far, so good.
The agency was established in 1829. The federal government was trying to remedy a situation in which settlers who were mining lead within Ho-Chunk territory had caused a conflict between them and the tribe. They were continually trespassing on Ho-Chunk land, so the government saw the only solution was either to remove the lead miners or remove the Ho-Chunk. And of course, it was decided it was more politically easy to remove the Ho-Chunk. So this treaty was held in 1829, and the Ho-Chunk were forced to sell all their land south of the Wisconsin River and west of modern-day Madison. So to be paid for that land, to have somebody to negotiate and meet with them at this pretty difficult time in their history, it was decided to establish an Indian agency here at Portage. And this Indian agency joined two others in Wisconsin, one at the starting point of the Wisconsin River, and one at the mouth of the Fox River. So one's in Green Bay, one's in Prairie du Chien. This agency cut the distance between those two established agencies by about 140 miles. So this was the first one in the area, and it became a cog in the bigger wheel of government interest in the Northwest. Of course, the lead mining issue that we briefly discussed was bringing more and more people here. The government saw this as a way to raise funds for its military, because the lead district was taxed to fund the ordnance department. They saw it as a way to turn this territory fairly quickly into a state. So this agency was here as the basically the implementation point of government policy, the bigger picture. It was the first in Wisconsin established through a removal treaty. This was before what you might call the Indian removal era. The Indian removal bill was established and passed through Congress in 1830. So the Ho-Chunk began being removed forcibly in 1829. So this was sort of before that began overall, and it was established specifically because of that 1829 treaty. And of course, it has a purposeful location. It's located at the Portage, so it's not only just a transportation hub, but it's also the place where the Ho-Chunk would often meet as a tribe. The tribe was spread out all over southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. So this had traditionally been their place to get together and make decisions. And so now the agency is established here as a contact point and at a pretty convenient spot for the tribe itself. So the Indian agent who was chosen to work here was John Harris Kinsey. He was born in 1803. He was the son of Chicago's second settler. The first settler was Mr. DeSable. He was an African-American man who sold his trading post to John Kinsey's father. 14 years old, he became apprenticed to the American Fur Company Island, which is right between the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and the mainland of Michigan. So he became involved in the fur trade and moved down to Prairie du Chien in southwest Wisconsin, where he worked for Joseph Rolette, a well-known fur trader there, and he began learning the Ho-Chunk language. And he learned the language. He wrote the first known pretty comprehensive dictionary of the Ho-Chunk language. And in this position, he began to sort of take on other duties. So he was working both as an fur trader, but he was also working as the assistant to Michigan Territory Governor Lewis Cass. Because of his language skills, he was working for Cass, and because of those language skills and relationship with the tribe, he was also considered the best option when a new agent was needed in 1829. So he received the appointment, but before he came out to the frontier, he went back east and got marrying Juliet McGill of Connecticut. She was born in Middletown, Connecticut, and she had pretty much the opposite of John's upbringing. John's only formal education was through his apprenticeship at American Fur Company. Juliet's formal education took her all the way through a couple years about a year of college. So she had a lot of education out there. She grew up in an upper class family. Her father was working for the Bank of the United States. But as she learned about the geography of the United States. She sort of had formed a sort of an attachment to the old Northwest, which is what we now would call the Midwest. Partly because she started hearing stories from her uncle, who had moved to Chicago in the 1820s, about what she saw the adventures going on out on the frontier. So these family connections and her love of geography brought her quite an interest in this area. So when she met John through her uncle, the two got married and began preparing to come west to the new Indian Agency. She knew that she would miss her Eastern lifestyle, so she began preparing in different ways to sort of deal with what she knew would be the seclusion of the frontier and the sort of remoteness from just about everything she'd known from her life in the East. So she insisted on bringing a lot of stuff with her. She brought essentially what were 3 30-foot lawn boats, full of furniture, sets of china, full-size piano, a lot of different things to the frontier to recreate her Eastern life out here at the agency. So that became our basis for the museum's furnishing plan. The house is furnished with a lot of things that you would just normally not expect to see on the frontier. So it's unique in that way that we're furnished with items from the period, but it's furnished at a level that you didn't see in Wisconsin for a number of years after the agency was established. So our agency story basically presents a case study of one particular agency within this bigger picture of agencies all across the United States. It was established during a time of change. Both the government, as settlers moved into Wisconsin, and for the whole country, as removal treaties were signed, as removal was continuing through the 1830s. It was a time of change because their traditional way of life relied upon the traditions and the seasonal movements that had become ingrained in their culture from living on the Wisconsin frontier. So it was a difficult time for them as they lost more and more land. How are they going to respond, and how are they going to sort of adjust? This agency provides a lot of anecdotes of how a person from an Eastern perspective who didn't understand the natives, who came to the West viewing these people as distant savages, came to understand the Ho-Chunk more through personal interaction. Juliet Kinsey left a memoir called Waban, which is the Potawatomi word for the early day. So it's subtitled in the Northwest. So it's talking about the early days of the Northwest. So we have firsthand stories about Juliet's transition from not really understanding what was going on out here to coming to a better understanding and appreciation of a different culture from her. It was sort of a balancing act out here. The Indian Department was operated by a lot of people who weren't actually living on the frontier, so they didn't necessarily know the immediate circumstances and the special situations of the frontier. So there's often a measure of push and tug between federal policy and what the agents saw on the ground. So John was often at times caught in the middle, but often having to find ways to implement policies that you would have known are going to be difficult for the tribe to accept. But at the same time, he was also had a strong relationship with the tribe and was also, to the best of his ability, looking after their interests as well. So it was a balancing act between, implementing policies that are going to be make big changes to the Ho-Chunk way of life versus what he knew to be the Ho-Chunk love of their traditional way of living. We also saw the agency navigating through war. The Black Hawk War of 1832 began spring of 1832 and continued through the summer. And Black Hawk, a Sauk leader, came up through Wisconsin. And this was one of those times when it really tried John Kinsey's skill as Indian agent in negotiating with the tribe during this time, trying to keep them neutral, and attempting to gain information from a tribe which had a lot of reasons to join with the hostile nation in the war. So it was a difficult time for John, but it also was a unique time for Juliet, coming from the East, to come to understand more about realities of frontier life. Another instance where the realities of frontier life came into pretty clear focus was during the winter of starvation. That winter of 1832 was the time when the Ho-Chunk had lost their crops. They had a bad winter hunt, partially because of the lateness of the annuity payment, which was brought by the territorial governor. And so Juliet had to come to understand, at least cope with the situation in which she saw suffering all around her, but saw, the character of the Ho-Chunk and shining through in some pretty powerful stories that she tells in her book. The late years of the agency represent a symbol of resilience. The Ho-Chunk were forced to leave Wisconsin by 1840. The agency was a big part of that. The final removal push was promoted from this site, from the connect at Fort Winnebago across the river. But the Ho-Chunk, as they were moved to Iowa, forced up to southern Minnesota, then to northern Minnesota, finally out to the Dakotas, and then out to Nebraska. During each of these phases of removal, the Ho-Chunk kept coming back to Wisconsin. And first they were trickling back and then being sent back to the reservations. But eventually they were allowed to homestead. And this agency represents a time that the Ho-Chunk go through something that would be almost unimaginable, having to leave their traditional homeland. But then it also represents that cultural resilience that brought them back. So it's a powerful story to really delve into. And before we go on, I'd like to mention something that's also going on during this time period. If you read the quote on the screen, that's not from a modern newspaper. That's from 1832, cholera outbreak. They're talking about case numbers a couple hundred years before we are today. Cholera was one issue that was concerning a lot of people at the time. It was a deadly disease. John Kinsey actually contracted it during the Black Hawk War. He, of course, survived. But another disease was actually more salient to this agency. The smallpoxes had started coming west. And John Kinsey knew that smallpox had reached Green Bay by about 1831. And he started taking measures to protect the tribe from its introduction, because smallpox had a devastating effect on one of the first ones to begin vaccinating the Ho-Chunk, or vaccinating any tribe. He received funds from the federal government, and over the course of a summer, he and the fur trader who lived right next door spent the summer vaccinating over 600 Ho-Chunk individuals. And it was never enough to prevent prevent the outbreak, but it's a unique side note where as a sort of a connection to what we're experiencing today, it's interesting to see the response that was crafted to it. So the Kinseys left the agency in 1830, moved back to Chicago, and came to upon some new opportunities because the government was settling old grudges against the treaties, which were forcing land cessions, resolving claims from the War of 1812. The Kinseys actually received a land grant from this, and they ended up owning most of what is now Navy Pier in Chicago. So they became essentially prospectors. Juliet Kinsey was a very accomplished artist. So she was the one to write up or draw up a map and description. She was also a good writer of the property, and they began selling some of it. And that brought them to some pretty prominent position in society. John became the second town president of Chicago before it became a city. And John and Juliet both spent a lot of their time and effort in building early Chicago. They were some of the first people to settle there, and both of them had a big influence on early Chicago civic life. As time went on, as times reached into the 1840s and 1850s, Chicago began industrializing, especially toward the 1860s. So as this happened, the Kinseys saw their place in society sort of recede from the fore. And Waban, which was Juliet's memoir, was one of those ways in which Juliet was trying to reassert her family's role in the founding of Chicago. So it's an interesting story to see how the Kinseys sort of experienced a lot of the different eras in Chicago's development. And there's a new book out called Juliet Kinsey, The World of Juliet Kinsey, Chicago Before the Fire, which is an interesting treatment of that if that's of interest to people. But this story of Chicago and the Kinseys brings us to our Great American Treasures connections between two historic sites. Earlier you heard from the Andrew House Museum. It's interesting that our house is actually connected to that house. And so Juliet's daughter, Eleanor, or Nellie, married William Gordon in December of 1857. Nellie had met him during her education in the eastern United States, and he was from the South. So if you look at that date, 1857, we're getting pretty close to a time when the Gordon family would be at very strong political odds with the Kinsey family. Kinsey family living in Chicago, they knew Abraham Lincoln. They were strongly opposed to the views of the Gordon family in the South, which the feeling was mutual between the two. So it began an era of family feuds. Things weren't too settled throughout the Civil War. John became a paymaster for the Union. William Gordon became a military leader in the South. And during this time, Nellie Gordon gave birth to Juliet McGill Gordon on October 31st, 1860. And come back to her in a minute. One of the interesting things that comes out of the agency's story is the Kinseys came into personal contact and friendships with some people such as Jefferson Davis, who was a young lieutenant at Fort Winnebago at the time, as well as other people who eventually became prominent in the Confederacy. When the Kinseys' sons were captured by the Confederacy during the Civil War, those connections became useful because Juliet, writing to Nellie, who then wrote to Jefferson Davis, eventually arranged their transfer back to the Union. The Kinsey's had a struggle to connect with their daughter throughout the Civil War. After Savannah fell, however, Nellie came back to live in Chicago until things settled down after the Civil War. And eventually, Nellie's daughter, Juliet, who's named after her grandmother, married Andrew, might not have the right name there, but the son of the person who built the Andrew Lowe House in 1886. Juliet, then Juliet Gordon Lowe died in the Andrew Lowe House, which was her residence at the time, in 1927. And as many of you know, Juliet Gordon Lowe is most famous for founding the Girl Scouts. 1912, Juliet Gordon Lowe held the first Girl Scout meeting in Savannah. And her organizational inspiration for the movement was Robert Baden-Powell, who had started scout movements in Europe, known to Juliet Gordon Lowe from some travels in Europe. And so he provided the organizational inspiration, but really the content inspiration came somewhat from Baden-Powell, but a lot of it is said to have come from her grandmother. She had heard stories about her grandmother learning to survive, learning to live on, at that time, a pretty secluded frontier. Nothing else, her grandmother's spirit and independent bent really helped influence a lot of the content inspiration in the Girl Scouts. Just one example is the original Girl Scout uniform included, and whatever they carried with them, included a tin cup. And I've seen it said that that tin cup goes back to a story of the Kinseys who, on one of their journeys through the Wisconsin frontier, had gotten lost. And Juliet writes how the tin cup she carried with her brought her quite a bit of comfort because you could cook in it, you could drink out of it, you could do a lot of things with it to survive on the frontier. So that's just one of the little anecdotes that is said to have inspired Juliet Gordon Lowe, her granddaughter. So this story was inspirational not only to her granddaughter, but it's an essential story for us in modern times. It tells of a time in United States history where we can't necessarily be overly proud of some of the things that went on, but we can still learn from its powerful stories of two people groups trying to interact Portage between the Fox and the Wisconsin rivers. So it's an important story to remember today, and the mission of the Historic Indian Agency House is to keep telling that story as long as we can. So if people have questions, I'd love to continue the discussion.
All right, well, we have a few up already. Are the Ho-Chunk and the Winnebago the same people?
Yes, Winnebago is the name that was given to the tribe by other tribes in the region. It means the people of the stinky water. The Ho-Chunk were living on an area of the Fox River that was pretty stagnant. It would have quite a smell in the summer. And so they were given that name by, I believe, the Menominee tribe. And when the French first came to Wisconsin in the early 1600s, they heard about the Ho-Chunk before they ever met them. And when they heard about them, they heard them called the Winnebago. So as a result of that, they continued calling them the Winnebago long after they'd actually met them. But the Ho-Chunk, that word comes from their word Ho-Chungra, which means people of the big voice. So that's what they've called themselves from as far as you can go back in oral tradition, all the way through the present. So it's same people, just two different names.
Okay. Here's another question. I heard archaeology was going on at the agency house. What was the most interesting find? Thank you.
All right. Well, we're doing an archaeology dig, which we started this year, and we're hoping to continue next year with a public information or public education archaeology dig to learn more about the agency blacksmith. The Indian agency had a blacksmith established at it to serve the Ho-Chunk Nation as a part of the Treaty of 1829. So we're trying to find it and learn more about it. We didn't find the blacksmith shop. We found some evidence of blacksmith's house. But I'd say the most interesting artifact was, well, in the midst of the domestic debris from a settler house, you know, things like broken china, coal, sawed bones from eating, different things like that. In the midst of all that was a brass tinkling cone, which is a starkly Native American object. So it sort of illustrates that, yes, this was a settlers institution. It was a place where Europeans were coming into traditional Native American land, but it also shows the agency history of that structure, because the Kinseys were giving gifts as part of the Ho-Chunk tradition of gift giving, and that tinkling cone was likely one of those gifts. So I'd say that's probably the most interesting thing that was found.
Here's a comment. We appreciate the Girl Scout connection, 2 Girl Scouts and a troop leader listening today. So we're glad you're here. And then a question, whom did you say started the vaccinations for the 600 Ho-Chunk?
That was an initiative started by John Kinsey. He received federal funding from the United States to do it, but he was apparently the first person to really push for that vaccination. And he also was the first one in the whole of American Indian Department history to actually request a doctor for the Ho-Chunk. Apparently the surgeon, who was living right across the river, refused to treat any but the worst cases among the natives. He refused to vaccinate the Ho-Chunk, so that's why John was doing it. So John didn't take that too well. So by the time he left the agency, he had acquired the services of a government, a doctor who was in Indian Department pay, who was specifically meant to serve the Ho-Chunk and the regional tribes.
And the New York cholera in 1832, that's really interesting because that was a huge concern here in Charleston as well. I've read letters among members of the Manigault family worried about that epidemic coming into Charleston. So
interesting thing about why John Kinsey got cholera at a time when it was nowhere near the frontier was because during the Black Hawk War, military units from the east, from I think some might have been drawn from the Charleston area. They were put together on ships, sent up through the Great Lakes, brought to Chicago to serve in the Black Hawk War. By the time they got there, they were, I don't know the exact numbers, but they had lost quite a few people to the epidemic and just essentially spread it prematurely to the whole frontier. So.
Okay. Could you repeat the name of Juliet Kinsey's daughter?
Eleanor Gordon. So, of course, Eleanor Kinsey, but she married William Gordon. So, but she's known in most literature as Nellie.
Okay. I have a question about the Ho-Chunk people have returned to the Portage area. Is there an establishment there or a tribe there? Or
well, that's a unique thing because there are Indian reservations in Wisconsin, specifically for the Menominee, some native tribes that have been moved west from New York. But the Ho-Chunk do not have a reservation in Wisconsin. They have a small reservation in Nebraska, but the movement back to Wisconsin was completely on their own. They took their own initiative. There are some small tribal properties in Wisconsin, but the Ho-Chunk back here came back because of their ties to the land, not because of their that they had any land set aside for them.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing story of resilience.
Yes. Yes. Can you just, hold on, we have a question here. What is a tinkling comb, if you don't mind explaining that again? A tinkling comb?
Tinkling cone is basically just a, if you take a sheet of thin brass material and you cut a little triangle of that and you roll up that triangle into basically a little brass cone, that's used as a decoration. Modern times, tribes use them in dances on what are called jingle dresses. They cut each other, make noise, but they're just a form of small decoration.
Okay. How large was the Ho-Chunk tribe?
Well, in 1832, John Kinsey wrote basically a form of a census of the Ho-Chunk tribe during the annuity payment. So in his agency, there were about 4,000 members of the tribe. I've seen numbers overall for probably about 6,000, which is spread across from Lake Winnebago all the way to the Mississippi River, all the way down into northern Illinois.
Okay. Is Juliet Kinsey's book in print anywhere? Alan, I don't know if you could find a link to her memoir, because that sounds really interesting.
We do have it in print in our gift shop.
Uh-huh.
And available online too.
Okay.
It's a very interesting read. It's old language, so some people find that a little bit difficult, but it's to get into the language. It's Juliet has a background in fiction writing. She wrote 2 fiction books during her lifetime, and Waban uses sort of fiction descriptive techniques to describe nonfiction events.
And how is Waban spelled?
WAU-BUN.
Okay. That sounds really interesting. So after the Kinseys left, the fort was still there. There was, because they had removed the Indians, there was no need for the Indian agency anymore. What happens to the house?
There was still a need for an Indian agent. A temporary agent took over for John for about a year. After him, a permanent Indian agent came by the name of McCabe. We don't know if he lived in the agency house or not, but he died of one of those epidemics after about a year. So after him, you're getting toward about 1835, and the government had decided at that point that in a lot of cases they don't need to spend the extra funds to hire agents, particular agents. A lot of times they would have the fort commanding officers do the job. So then the duties of agent devolved on the commanding officer of the fort, and the commanding officer had those duties as agent until the Ho-Chunk were moved around 1840.
Okay. And the National Society of Colonial Dames of America in Wisconsin acquired the property in 1931, I think. Did I read that?
1930 to 1931.
Okay. And how much restoration was needed or has been ongoing? You've got it restored to the time when Juliet Kinsey would have been living there?
Well, we have it, like you said, restored to the time now, but it took a bit of a process. During the Great Depression, the colonial dames hired architects and workmen from the Portage area to do the work on the house. They thankfully they got to it before any type of plumbing, any type of electricity was ever introduced to the area, or to the house at least. and so they didn't have any of that to reverse. They added on one of the porches of the house had been taken off. They could still see the faded shadow where that porch gable had been. So they redid some of the porches. They not sure of the exact extent of the work they did inside, but it was not as much restoration needed as some houses, but restoration has continued over the years. I believe there's one in the mid 1900s, and then the most recent was in 2012, when the original foundation was reinforced. Quite a process, but it's as far as we can tell now, it's in pretty well the state that it was when the Kinseys were here.
Was the removal of the ho-chunk peaceful, or were they forced?
Well, if you just look at the records, you see that they sold their land rather than being just forced to get off of it. But most of those sales were forced sales. They did not want to sell any of their land in 1829. They ended up having their hand forced in that matter that year. 1832, they were the same story. They were to sell more. The Redbird Uprising of 1827, which predated the Treaty of 1829, really ended up bringing out among the tribe the general opinion that resistance to the government was not in their best interests. They knew that they would be treated pretty roughly if that conflict were to occur. So technically the removal occurred peacefully, but that doesn't mean that force and military, the military was not involved. The military actually was used to effect the main removal of the remaining remnants of the tribe that had not moved. So it was technically not a wartime, but it was, I wouldn't say it was peaceful either.
And we have a comment. Thanks, Adam. Love this site.
All right.
Does anybody else have any other questions or comments?
Thanks, Adam. That was great.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank everybody. I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and hopefully sometime y'all get to come up and visit the agency house.